Welcome back. This time, I would like to address with you the issue of immigration. About a year ago, I uploaded my first video about immigration, and I presented many of the ideas I'm going to present now. But I am creating this video also because yesterday I had the opportunity to read in Foreign Affairs an article by Alexander Kostov, How to Win on Immigration. And it happens that this article coincides about 95% with what I have been preaching for more than a year. So I wanted to use the occasion to try to re-update this debate. In my proposal, you have no uh, a bill, but the tools, the components that could allow you to draft a liberal bill or a conservative bill, depending on the mood of the chamber, depending on the political climate at the moment. That is, in this case, will be 2028 because it's a bit pretentious. It would be a bit pretentious to try to draft a bill regardless of that consideration. Besides, even in 2028, you might find or the chambers that have one more tilt toward a liberal position, and while the other might tilt to a conservative position. And so that's why we should take this factor into account. And why should we be so cautious to try to create not a bill that is aligned, but a range within many possible combinations, compatible combinations may be created? Because 2028 may be a critical year for immigration. And if we allow we allow voters to face in 2028 the same failed options they have found faced in 2024, that is MAGA's cruelty or the childishness of Abolish ICE that turned this issue toxic in the first place during the Biden administration, we will have failed miserably. Because otherwise because that way we will be expecting voters to find the middle way between MAGA and woke, and as we know, uh, those middle points may be those attempts may be very counterproductive. You just have to see what happens to this issue. Yet you see that the American public is open to see alternatives. But in 2028, if you are for immigration reform, whether you are a Democrat or Republican, you should be able to present an alternative. Otherwise, many are going to just rationalize, well, we tried the humanitarian way with Biden. That's not the humanitarian way. Those were just the whims of mediocre activists, mediocre abolish ICE activists that kidnap this issue and turn it into a weapon that. So let me be clear. If you see the global economic effects of immigration during the Biden administration, you would conclude that immigration should have been an asset for Biden. Instead, it was a liability because of the chaotic way, the irresponsible way it was managed, because precisely the effect of these cool activists. Now, in this ranch, we will have two limits. Of course, a left limit that is I have defined by the Kennedy-McCain of 2005, with an addition, a valuable addition from the Schumer bill of 2013. And that valuable addition is the definition of immigration, a definition of immigration that is crafted based on the needs of the American people and not on the needs of immigrants. That's something that have plagued the immigration narrative for a long time. And as Kustop says in his articles, you have to reshape, you have to reframe immigration so it reflects the needs of the American people, not the needs of immigrants. Even if your heart is with the needs of immigrants, because otherwise you have a product that is not sellable. On the right, on the conservative side, I have precisely used what Kustop is preaching now. I have been preaching for a long time, is using the interest, the legitimate interest of Americans when it comes to immigration, and providing solutions where the anti-immigrant positions like MAGA only offer excuses. And why is this important? Because you have concrete things that not MAGA, but an honest American concern about immigration will get, but only if we get immigration reform. And even immigration reform, even a path to citizenship, it should be crafted in terms of the interests of Americans. So, having defined the left position of the Kennedy-McCain of 2005, plus the definition of immigrant, the qualifications of immigrants, as taken from the Schumer bill of 2013, let me focus on the conservative bill that I drafted. In this conservative system, you have a permanent, the general system. In the general system, you have those visas that grant the right to work. That means that not every visa grants the right to work. That's what it means. Is this unprecedented? No. You have an H-1B visa for a long time that the spouse of one H-1B visa holder may have the spouse may even have a social security number, but not the right to work, regardless of the fact that she could or he could adjust its status by earning an H-1B visa by itself, herself or himself. So it's not unprecedented. It's just that it has not been done before. But let me make some considerations before we get into the general system. The system, whatever path you give immigrants, unless they are temporary workers, of course, should be permanent. The path for undocumented immigrants should be permanent. Whether it has the right to vote or it doesn't, whether it has limited access to welfare or depending on how do you define welfare, or he does or he doesn't. So depending, regardless of these characteristics, the access to this system should be permanent. Why? Because otherwise it's very easy for the MAGA side to introduce poison pills in the administrative poison pills in the process that would derail this process at the time of the renewal of these visas. And it's not that this has not been tried before. For instance, in the past, anti-immigrant zealots started demanding from immigrants, from applicants, the birth certificate, not the copy, but the original. And very few countries provide the original. Most countries just provide copies. So if for the renewal, you decide that you want the original, you would preclude most people from renewing their status after you have already taken all the concessions that immigration reform would imply, because don't believe that immigration reform is going to be born out of rational dialogue about the need and characteristics of immigration in the country. No, there will be concessions in terms of enforcement. And those concessions, as it happened during the Bush administration and during the Obama administration, will be kept by the anti-immigrant zealots, while the promised benefits will never materialize. So this ranch should be able to contemplate scenarios. Of course, that's why I mentioned, regardless of what the permanent status is, because in the worst case scenario, for instance, if you tell me that the new visas are not going to have the new visas are going to lead you to citizenship, but to a kind of citizenship that don't include the right to vote, that's a that's something I would take unless if there is no other alternative, but only if we deprive immigrants from the right to vote and not other political rights like running for office or participating in campaigns, because precisely that's what we want from immigrants, to get integrated into the mainstream, not to become a cultural enclave where that is indifferent about the future of the nation. Then something I hated from the 2013 Schumer bill, that was that it confiscated the contributions made by undocumented immigrants to Social Security and Medicare as if it were drug money. You don't confiscate those contributions, but you could give them the treatment of undue payments to the IRS. So if you had an ITIN and tax identification number, you could keep those contributions in your account, and if you don't, well, you would be able to be refunded for the contributions you made in the last 3 years. And why is this important? Because we don't have a generation of immigrants that become poor in their old age. And if we deprive them of the contributions, we would deprive them we would also deprive them of the points they make in order to get a pension, in order to get access to Medicare. So, and that's something that goes beyond beyond what is acceptable as a concession. So immigrants should at least be able to keep the points. Then, if you tell me that during the probation period I propose in my conservative proposal, and that could be applied easily to a liberal proposal, the government defines your location and your occupation according to the needs of the country. Like, for instance, after COVID, there were in Pennsylvania and other places even Republican mayors requesting the immigrants to revive their local economies and get the immigrants wherever they wanted to go, instead of wherever the nation need them to go. Or, for instance, you are not going to get doctors out of new immigrants, but you can get nurses. You can get some people who are you can qualify them for occupations that are in high demand, like nurses and senior care, and that would be your contribution. If you tell me that you are the man, if I put in my proposal $10,000 fee, not fine for the reasons I'm going to explain, but a fee, then I would agree to that, considering all the cost in time, or for instance the payment to smugglers, that is on average $10,000. So it would be much better. That would be the cost, not for the possibility of coming here illegally, but for to the possibility of you earning without major risk, financial risk, your place in the American dream. And of course, the case of benefits. If you tell me that immigrants are not going to access welfare, well, in general, I agree. But for instance, in the case of Medicaid, that's a point where I would not be able to agree. Why? Because that would exclude many immigrants that comes with no assets, with all or with what is left of their savings for all wealth, and expose them to, for instance, an accident in the workplace. If they have an accident in the workplace, or something in the family gets sick, you would condemn them to poverty, indefinite poverty, because they would not be able to access the benefits of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, like the expansion of Medicaid. So, considering the cost of health care in the United States, that would be too much to ask. If you tell me that they will not be able to access Section 8 for affordable housing, I can take it. But if you were talking about Medicaid, especially considering how vulnerable immigrants can be in the first years of their stay, well, that's a bridge too far. Then, now, let me go to the general system. In the general system, in my conservative proposal, you have the visas that grants you the right to work in the United States. To access to these visas, you have to earn those visas. So, the American system so far is more inclined to assess the qualities of your sponsor instead of you, even though you are the immigrant who are going to stay here, grow, raise his children here, vote here. We are assessing more the qualities of your sponsors than your qualities, and that's a huge mistake. And many say, well, we don't have them to be a public burden. What we are talking, that's ridiculous, even though it has been repeated endlessly. It's still a ridiculous line, considering that we are talking about immigrants who are going to spend the rest of their lives here. So, yes, just remember, for instance, the case of Miami. All these considerations about they don't being a public burden were completely ignored when it came to Cuban immigrants to Miami. And that was the right decision, because that allowed them to take risks, be more entrepreneurial, and that's how they turned Miami into a thriving economic zone, prosperous economic zone. Why? Because in that case, we bet on the Cuban entrepreneurship to turn Miami into what it is now, instead of trying to came with petty considerations like you may become a public burden. Well, if you are chronically a public burden despite opportunities, that's a different point. But if you are preemptively going to preclude an immigrant for opportunities just because he might become a public burden, that's not only unfair but also short-sighted. So how do you get your position in this line? Because, and when let me make here a pause, because there have been many misconceptions. about immigration that has taken root in the public debate just because nobody in the democratic side or pro-immigrant side, the so-called pro-immigrant side, bothered to set the record straight. And that one of those is the line, the concept of the line. In the American system, so far, we don't have a line. We have multiple lines for some, and these lines may be very short in the case, for instance, of Western European, or very large very long in the case of Mexicans and people of Filipino descent. In the case of in the first case, it may take a few months. When in the latter case, it could take 20 to 30 years. And for those who, most of whom ended up being undocumented, for those who don't have the right sponsors, well, there is no line. No, absolutely no line. So it's time to end up eradicating these misconceptions. And the general system, for instance, that's one of the things it tries to do because it creates a line. So now it's not that because I have the right sponsor or I come from the right country, I have the right to come here in months, while the others don't have, are thrown into a limbo. And that's where I bring the inspiration of this conservative position. That is the work of John F. Kennedy in 1958, A Nation of Immigrants. And the basic premises of this proposal, you must read it in 1958, where that the chances of an applicant to become a legal immigrant should not be decided by accidents of birth. And what are those? What are accidents of birth? Country of origin, family, that kind of things. What should define your chance to come here legally are your skills and your character. Of course, he has worked, and the third milestone of this proposal is to make possible honest family reunification. So let's go to the if we are going to base the chances of an immigrant to come here legally on his skills and character, then we need a system of points that based on which we can make a ranking. But we should not limit the issue to skills. Character should count. For instance, if you have had a chance to invest in your education, that should help you, and that comes when that is counts as skills. But for instance, what if you have been a community organizer in your country, a person who fought, who care more all about your community and not just about yourself? That should count too. Uh, Other things are commitments that you can only test in a probation period. That's why I created this 5-year probation period in which you should first show your commitment to the United States to integrate to American institutions. So why not volunteer 180 hours in American institutions, whether they are your church, your party, your cat shelter, whatever, that show that you are willing to integrate and not just stay inside the limited walls of your cultural enclave, something that has been criticized legitimately by many people at the center and at the right. Then, when it comes to English, if I go to test your listening and your speaking, I could be maybe a bit unfair. But if I if I test you for your reading and your writing, when you come here, depending on the category and subcategory you are going to apply, it may be fair, and then I can give you 5 years to improve your English and be tested, not the certificate, to be tested on those skills at the end of those 5 years or before. So depending, you would be able to take that test as many times as you want, as long as at the end of those 5 years you have met the minimum requirements from your category and subcategory. And when I speak about category and subcategory, I'm talking about immigrant and guest worker, because we should, of course, give priority to immigrants unless we deal with limited cases like, for instance, the circular migration in the South that was interrupted after 9/11, that worked pretty well because these Mexican farmers, uh, uh, crop pickers, were not interested in staying in the United States. They just came to the United States during the harvest, and then they returned to Mexico, and that the same thing year after year. But unfortunately, that was interrupted after unjustifiable, because it didn't affect any national security concern, and that was interrupted after 9/11. So unless you have with those very specific considerations, I should prefer an immigrant to a temporary worker, but also demand more from an immigrant than from a temporary worker when it comes to commitments. Same thing about skilled workers and unskilled workers. Though here the numbers should be given by an independent indicator I'm going to mention in a moment. But of course, I should expect a tougher level from a skilled worker, which will be unrealistic in the case of unskilled workers. And another opportunity to another commitment that I have considered is the investing in your own education, in your own skills. So at the end of the 5 year probation, you have count more skills and are less likely to become a public burden. It's not getting affidavit from a sponsor what should count, because it's helping them to get the licenses and education so they can help themselves, not after the 5 years, but during the rest of their lives. Now, how is the number of these visas are going to be determined? Is it going to be determined depending on the labor demand, the needs of the market, and the needs of the market is going to should be reflected in an indicator created by the Bureau of Labor Statistics that determines where do we need more labor, skill and unskilled, and then given those priorities, with the exception of circular migration, give the priority to migrants over temporary workers. Why? Because they represent a long-term commitment with the United States, the commitment that we could not demand from temporary workers. That brings me to the case of family and asylum. In my opinion, and in this conservative proposal, family and asylum are not limited to to the numbers created by this indicator of the excess of labor demand, which is, let me say, let me say, the goal of this indicator of excess of labor demand is precisely to prevent that those huge gaps between supply and demand that creates windows of opportunity for new illegal immigration. If you close those gaps because you provide enough workers, the chances of somebody taking the risk of investing $10,000 in coming illegally when probably he's not going to find it's going to be much harder to find a job as an undocumented worker are going to increase. The risks are going to increase, and therefore that would be the most efficient incentive to use the legal path instead of paying a smuggler on a venture that may end up very bad, because even if you succeed, it's going to be for you very difficult to repay the debt you have acquired just to come here illegally. So, having said that, is how do you define the number of visas in the case of family, considering that family based on immigration is going to depend, is not going to include a right to work in the United States? The numbers of these, we don't need to limit the numbers of these visas. It could just have two restrictions. The first restriction is that, of course, in this case, you need a sponsor. Your family, your relative who is trying to bring you to the United States. And this affidavit, they would have to prove it with an affidavit that he can support you for us at least until you can adjust the status. Otherwise, and this could be a win-win for America, the win for the family, because they will be legitimately unified without all the burdens that the suspicion of the relative being an economic immigrant implies. And the second issue is that they are basically just demand. They don't supply. They don't add to the supply or labor supply. They just demand goods and services. So that's a win for America. You may say, well, but what if these people want to cheat the system? Well, in that case, I remember that we are aware that any attempt at immigration reform in 2028 would require concessions, and concessions like, for instance, mandatory verify or even biometric documents. So for these people trying to cheat the system, is going to be extremely difficult. The chances are not zero. There will always be some nanny that can work in cash, but those will be the exceptions, not the massive numbers we have now, because our immigration system is ineffective, inefficient. Consider that efficient immigration system would not have had 15 million immigrants, out of which 8 or 9 may be working right now in the economy, without a huge gap between the needs of the market and the number of visas. And so that would solve the problem of any people, any person, any people trying to manipulate the family-based system just to bypass the general system and come here to work. The other case is asylum, because in the case of asylum, the number of visas would have to be determined by Congress, depending on the funds, but those funds will depend on what our commitments to our values really are. Because in the same way as in the case of family-based immigration, many people have tried to use asylum as a shortcut to a work permit, and that should end, because all the what we have gotten is that now legitimate your chances, if you are a legitimate asylum seeker, are lower if you uh, go with your honesty for all asset, and with respect to the case of somebody who is trying to play the system after being coached by a smart lawyer. So that's why I believe asylum visas should not include the right to work. Besides, if you are coming here because you are persecuted, the case of an asylum seeker, in your country of birth, then your priority should be to be protected from harm, not to work in the United States. So we again should get rid of the petty, short-sighted premise that says that he should be able to sustain himself uh, as soon as possible, so you can move to the next one. That means that they are going to be idle until the problem in their country of birth is solved. No, you have to protect their skills with access to education. You could pay them an stipend that is a contribution for that would be the way these asylum seekers can contribute to the cost of supporting them. And I am thinking, for instance, on the demands on specific job demands in certain projects or in certain towns that require the presence of immigrants for different reasons. So, but the matter is that it should not be a way to work for market wages, so you can save money, and because that's not should not be the reason why you came here as an asylee. You didn't come here to make money. You came here to be protected from persecution. And that means that this family and asylum status could preclude you forever from the general system. No, you can adjust status, but this status should not give you any advantage over those who are applying to the general system, regardless of the previous application as a family member or as an asylum seeker. Finally, factors like artificial intelligence or the unpredictability of what is going to happen with the immigration narrative, considering that Democrats are still playing dead on the issue or outright throwing immigrants under the bus. If we don't present an alternative different from what we have, an alternative that could appeal, as Alexander Kustov says, to the specific needs, not to general vaporous needs like of the economy, like for instance the contribution to the GDP, but to the contribution to needs in terms that the American people can feel they can get only if they give the undocumented immigrants a chance to the chance they never had to come here legally in exchange of some concessions like the ones I have mentioned before. Concessions they can measure in terms of their own benefit. The native born is most probably going to fall down to the two failed narratives that define 2024. And in that case, we will have wasted 2028 with the most likely probability that 2032 is going to be much less generous with any possibility of immigration reform. So we have to do all that is possible to prevent that voters find as alternatives Biden's Abolish ICE, making at the border as alternative one, and MAGA's cruelty as alternative two. Because then, otherwise, again, many people are going to rationalize, as I mentioned before, that we have already tried the Biden's way, and that my opinion is the mediocre way, and it has failed. So whether we like it or not, we have to go with Trump's cruelty because there seems to be no alternative. Well, that's the job for people who are really serious about immigration. The idea is to present this alternative. And that's why I have created this as a ranch so that it can entice, it can lure both honest people from the center left and honest people from the center right. And then if it gains enough visibility, then the mediocre politicians that are happy with pandering to the extremes when it comes to this issue are not going to find so easy to ignore the alternatives. So, having said that, it's up to you, and I have submitted this proposal to some organizations, and hopefully we will have some improvement by 2028. And having said that, thank you.
And now, an important message from the Democratic Party.